3 days before my son tried to break down my front door with a sledgehammer, I discovered he had already scheduled a room for me at a nursing home. Not because I was sick. Not because I could no longer care for myself. But because he and my daughter-in-law wanted my house. What happened next left the entire neighborhood speechless. Hello, my friends. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 67 years old, retired, widowed, and living in a quiet little town outside Indianapolis. Over the years, I've learned that betrayal rarely arrives wearing a villain's face. Most of the time, it comes from someone whose hand you once held while crossing a street. Someone whose scraped knees you bandaged. Someone whose future mattered more to you than your own comfort. Today, I'd like to tell you about a woman named Margaret Whitmore, and how one quiet widow discovered that her son wasn't waiting for her approval anymore. He was waiting for her absence. Margaret was 71 years old when all of this happened. She lived in a white 2-story house on the edge of Bloomington, Indiana. The house wasn't fancy. It didn't sit behind gates or overlook a lake. But every inch of it carried a memory. The oak tree in the front yard had been planted by her husband, Richard, the year their son Daniel was born. The porch swing had been built by Richard during a summer when money was tight but hope was plentiful. The kitchen still held faint scratches on the pantry door where Daniel's height had been measured every birthday from age 5 until he left for college. To anyone else, it was simply a house. To Margaret, it was an entire lifetime. Richard had passed away 18 months earlier after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. Some losses arrive like storms. Others arrive like winter. Slow. Quiet. Permanent. Margaret still found herself reaching toward Richard's side of the bed some mornings before remembering he wasn't there. She still caught herself setting out 2 coffee mugs. She still paused whenever she passed his favorite chair in the living room. Grief had become less sharp over time. But it never truly left. After Richard died, Margaret did what many widows do. She leaned on family. Especially Daniel. Her only child. Her boy. At 44 years old, Daniel seemed responsible enough. Successful enough. Trustworthy enough. At least that's what Margaret believed. And for a while, everything appeared normal. Daniel called every week. Rebecca, his wife, stopped by occasionally. They brought groceries. Helped with errands. Asked how she was doing. The attention felt comforting. Even healing. But little by little, something began to change. Margaret couldn't explain it at first. The questions started appearing more often. Questions that had nothing to do with her health. Nothing to do with her happiness. Nothing to do with whether she felt lonely. Instead, Rebecca became curious about things Margaret had never discussed before. Have you updated your will? Do you still keep the same financial advisor? Who would handle things if something happened to you? Is the house fully paid off? At first, Margaret assumed Rebecca was simply trying to help. After all, estate planning was a practical subject. People their age talked about such things. But eventually the questions became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while sharing tea at Margaret's dining room table, Rebecca casually asked a question that lingered in Margaret's mind long after the conversation ended. If you ever moved somewhere smaller, what do you think this house would be worth? Margaret remembered staring at her cup. Not because she knew the answer. But because she suddenly wondered why Rebecca cared. The room had felt strangely quiet. The kind of silence that appears right before something changes. Then there was Daniel. He started offering to help with financial matters. At first, he suggested organizing paperwork. Then he recommended consolidating accounts. Later, he proposed adding his name to certain documents for convenience. Each suggestion sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they felt different. Like pieces of a puzzle Margaret couldn't quite see. One evening she stood in the hallway looking at an old photograph. Daniel was 10 years old. Freckles across his cheeks. Missing front tooth. A baseball glove nearly as large as his torso. On the back of the photograph, written in crooked childhood handwriting, were 6 simple words. Mom, you'll always be my hero. Margaret ran her fingers across the faded ink. She smiled. Then, unexpectedly, tears filled her eyes. Because lately she wasn't sure her son saw her at all. Not as a hero. Not even as a mother. Only as someone standing between him and something he wanted. The thought felt cruel. Unfair. Perhaps even paranoid. So she pushed it away. Until the phone call from the bank arrived. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Margaret was watering plants near the kitchen window when her cell phone rang. The woman from the bank sounded professional but concerned. Mrs. Whitmore, we're simply verifying a few inquiries regarding your accounts. Margaret frowned. Inquiries? Yes, ma'am. Someone recently requested information regarding ownership structures and future access procedures. The words made little sense. But something about them unsettled her. Who requested that information? She asked. There was a brief pause. I'm afraid I can't disclose details, but we thought it appropriate to notify you. When the call ended, Margaret stood motionless beside the sink. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, a strange feeling settled in her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced years earlier when Daniel was 16 and trying very hard to hide something. A mother's instinct. The quiet voice that whispers before the evidence arrives. That afternoon, Margaret climbed the stairs and entered the bedroom she had shared with Richard for 43 years. She opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside rested old photographs. Christmas cards. Letters. Memories. And one of Richard's flannel shirts. She lifted it carefully. Even after all this time, she could almost imagine his scent. For several moments she sat silently on the edge of the bed. Then she spoke aloud. A habit she'd developed since losing him. I wish you were here, Richard. The room offered no reply. Only silence. Yet somehow she knew exactly what her husband would have said. Pay attention. Trust what you're seeing. Not what you hope is true. That night Margaret made a decision. Not because she wanted conflict. Not because she wanted revenge. But because she needed the truth. The whole truth. And she had a growing suspicion she wasn't going to like what she found. The next morning, she contacted a private investigator. A retired detective recommended by a friend from church. She never imagined that decision would uncover a plan already in motion. A plan involving her house. Her savings. Her future. And a nursing home room that had already been reserved in her name. At the time, Margaret knew none of that. She only knew something felt wrong. Very wrong. And for the first time since Richard died, she realized an uncomfortable possibility. The people she trusted most might no longer be protecting her. They might be preparing to replace her. And before this story is over, you'll see exactly what happened when a 71-year-old widow decided she was finished being underestimated. Part 2. The private investigator's name was Thomas Grady. He was 63 years old. A retired detective from Monroe County. The kind of man who spoke very little, and noticed everything. When Margaret called him, she almost felt embarrassed. After all, what was she really accusing her son of? Nothing. At least, nothing she could prove. Just a feeling. A mother's instinct. A growing sense that something wasn't right. Still. Thomas agreed to meet her. 2 days later, they sat across from one another in a quiet diner just outside Bloomington. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. For a moment she wondered if she was making a mistake. Maybe I'm imagining things, she admitted. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He simply waited. The silence encouraged her to continue. My son keeps asking questions about my finances. Thomas nodded. Anything else? My daughter-in-law keeps bringing up my will. Anything else? Margaret hesitated. Then she sighed. I don't feel like they're worried about me anymore. Thomas studied her carefully. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice remained calm. In my experience, people usually call me after they see something. He leaned back slightly. You called me because you felt something. Margaret lowered her eyes. The distinction mattered. Because deep down, she already knew. Something had changed. Something important. Thomas agreed to look into things. Nothing illegal. Nothing invasive. Just enough to determine whether her concerns had any foundation. When they finished, Margaret drove home feeling strangely guilty. Almost as if she had betrayed Daniel. The thought hurt. Because she remembered another version of her son. A different Daniel. A little boy who once refused to spend his allowance because he wanted to buy his mother a birthday present. A 12-year-old who used to leave handwritten notes on the refrigerator. A teenager who cried when Richard was hospitalized after a construction accident. That Daniel had loved his family fiercely. At least he used to. The drive home took nearly 30 minutes. The entire time. Margaret found herself wondering the same thing. When had everything changed? Or perhaps the more painful question was this. Had Daniel changed? Or had she simply failed to see who he had become? The following week felt unusually quiet. Margaret kept herself busy. She always did. There were flower beds to tend. Laundry to fold. Bills to organize. Church on Sunday. Coffee with friends on Wednesday. The routines helped. But beneath those routines, anxiety lingered. Every time the phone rang, she wondered if it was Thomas. Every time Daniel called, she listened more carefully than before. And what she heard disturbed her. Because once she started paying attention, certain patterns became impossible to ignore. Have you thought about downsizing? Daniel asked during one conversation. Margaret smiled politely. No. A pause. Then another question. What about one of those retirement communities? No. Another pause. They have nurses there. I'm not sick. Mom, that's not what I meant. But Margaret noticed something. Daniel never asked whether she was happy. Only whether she was staying. As if her location mattered more than her well-being. As if the house itself had become the center of every conversation. One Friday afternoon Rebecca stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a blueberry pie. A gesture that might have seemed thoughtful. Except Rebecca rarely baked. And she almost never visited without a reason. Margaret invited her inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Sunlight spilled across the counters. For a few minutes they exchanged small talk. Weather. Church events. A neighbor's new puppy. Then Rebecca casually brought up the subject again. The house. Have you ever had it appraised? Margaret looked up from her coffee. No. You should. Why? Rebecca shrugged. No reason. A smile. Too quick. Too rehearsed. Margaret felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Then Rebecca said something that stayed with her for days. Places like this don't stay in families forever. The room became strangely quiet. Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law. Rebecca smiled as though she'd said nothing important. But something in her eyes felt wrong. Cold. Calculating. Almost impatient. As though she were waiting for time to move faster. Margaret suddenly remembered something Richard once told her. Years ago. Back when Daniel was still in high school. They had been discussing investments. Property values. Future planning. Richard had laughed and said, never trust someone who talks more about what happens after you're gone than what happens while you're here. At the time, Margaret thought it was simply one of Richard's observations. Now it sounded like a warning. That evening she walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest again. Inside rested dozens of memories. Photographs. Letters. Old birthday cards. Family vacations. Pieces of a life that suddenly felt very far away. She pulled out an envelope labeled Daniel, age 10. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was uneven. Childlike. Misspelled in places. Margaret unfolded it carefully. Mom. Thank you for always helping me. Thank you for making my lunches. Thank you for coming to my baseball games. I love you. You are my hero. Love. Daniel. Margaret sat quietly on the edge of the bed. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. Not because she was old. Because she was heartbroken. How could the same child write those words? And grow into a man who seemed more interested in her house than her happiness? The question lingered. Unanswered. Painful. Heavy. Eventually she placed the letter back inside the envelope. Then she reached for Richard's flannel shirt. The same shirt she always kept nearby. She pressed it against her chest. And for the first time in months, she cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way people cry when nobody is watching. The way widows cry. The way mothers cry. Because losing a husband hurts. But watching your child slowly become a stranger hurts in an entirely different way. 3 days later Thomas finally called. His voice sounded different. More serious. Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret immediately sat down. What is it? I think we should meet. Her stomach tightened. Did you find something? A pause. Yes. The single word seemed to drain all warmth from the room. When? Tomorrow morning. Can you tell me now? Another pause. Longer this time. Then Thomas exhaled. Not over the phone. Margaret barely slept that night. The house felt unusually large. Every creak seemed louder. Every shadow darker. At 2 a.m. she found herself sitting in the living room. Richard's favorite chair stood across from her. Empty. As always. She stared at it. And whispered into the silence. I wish you were here. No answer came. Only memories. And fear. The next morning Margaret arrived 15 minutes early. Thomas was already waiting. A thick folder rested on the table between them. The moment she saw it, she knew. This wasn't about misunderstandings. This wasn't about assumptions. This was evidence. Real evidence. Thomas didn't rush. He opened the folder slowly. Then slid the first document across the table. Margaret looked down. Her heart stopped. It was a brochure. A nursing home brochure. Highlighted sections. Pricing information. Admission requirements. Notes written in the margin. Daniel's handwriting. Margaret recognized it instantly. For several seconds she couldn't speak. She simply stared. Trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Finally she looked up. What is this? Thomas met her eyes. There's more. And suddenly, Margaret understood. Whatever remained inside that folder was going to change her life forever. To be continued. Part 3. Margaret stared at the nursing home brochure. For several long seconds. The words refused to make sense. She read them once. Then twice. Then a third time. The highlighted sections blurred together. Admission process. Monthly care plan. Priority placement. Resident transition program. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. Not because of age. Because of shock. She looked up at Thomas. There has to be some mistake. Her voice sounded distant. Almost unfamiliar. Thomas remained quiet. Careful. Respectful. The way people become when they're about to deliver bad news. I wish there was. Margaret swallowed hard. A knot formed in her throat. She looked down again. Daniel's handwriting covered parts of the brochure. Short notes. Questions. Calculations. Things a son should never be researching behind his mother's back. The worst part wasn't the brochure itself. It was the realization that Daniel hadn't simply thought about it. He had been planning. Actively planning. Weeks. Possibly months. Maybe longer. Thomas slowly opened the folder again. There are additional documents. Margaret didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to see them. But she forced herself to nod. Thomas slid another sheet across the table. This one wasn't a brochure. It was an email. Printed. Highlighted. Margaret recognized Daniel's email address immediately. The message had been sent to a legal consultant. The subject line made her stomach tighten. Future property transition. Margaret felt cold. Despite the warm coffee sitting untouched beside her. She began reading. The first few lines seemed harmless. Questions about inheritance. Ownership. Estate procedures. Then she reached one sentence. And everything changed. If my mother enters assisted living within the next 6 months, how quickly can ownership transfer be simplified? Margaret stopped breathing. For a moment. The entire diner disappeared. The sounds. The conversations. The clatter of dishes. All gone. Only that sentence remained. Echoing. Repeating. Again. And again. And again. If my mother enters assisted living. 6 months. Ownership transfer. Simplified. Not concern. Not love. Not protection. Convenience. Efficiency. Property. She remembered teaching Daniel how to ride a bicycle. She remembered sitting beside his hospital bed when he broke his arm. She remembered working double shifts after Richard was laid off one winter. Everything she had done. Every sacrifice. Every sleepless night. Every prayer. Reduced to paperwork. And timelines. And property transfers. There's more. Thomas said it gently. Almost apologetically. Margaret wasn't sure she could handle more. But somehow she nodded. The next document was worse. Far worse. A text message exchange. Between Daniel and Rebecca. Thomas had obtained it legally through information connected to a separate inquiry involving the consultant. The messages weren't lengthy. They didn't need to be. A few sentences were enough. Rebecca. Did you ask about the house yet? Daniel. Working on it. Rebecca. The sooner everything is settled, the sooner we can move in. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She kept reading. Rebecca. Honestly, I don't know why she's still trying to manage that place by herself. Daniel. Give it time. Then another message. One that would haunt Margaret for weeks. Rebecca. The sooner she's gone, the sooner we can start our real life. Gone. Not moved. Not helped. Gone. The words sat on the page like poison. Margaret lowered the papers. She couldn't continue. Not yet. Tears threatened. But she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. Thomas gave her time. Several minutes passed. Neither spoke. Eventually Margaret looked through the diner window. A young mother was helping her little boy cross the parking lot. The child held her hand tightly. trusting completely. Margaret watched them disappear into another storefront. And suddenly, she remembered Daniel at that age. 5 years old. Maybe 6. Always reaching for her hand. Always looking back to make sure she was still there. The memory hurt more than anything inside the folder. Because that little boy still existed in her mind. Even if he no longer existed in reality. Mrs. Whitmore. Thomas spoke quietly. You don't have to look at the rest today. Margaret shook her head. No. Her voice became firmer. I need to see everything. Because denial was no longer protecting her. The truth was painful. But lies were worse. Thomas handed over another document. This one came from a real estate office. Margaret frowned. Then she noticed something highlighted near the bottom. A property evaluation request. Address. Her address. Her house. Her home. The place where Richard had spent 30 years building a life. The request had been submitted 3 weeks earlier. Not by Margaret. Not by anyone authorized. But by someone seeking preliminary market estimates. Rebecca's contact information appeared in the file. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment she could almost hear Richard's voice. Soft. Steady. Patient. The way he always sounded. We built this place together, Maggie. He used to call her Maggie. Nobody else did. Only Richard. We built it one paycheck at a time. She remembered those years. The leaking roof. The second-hand furniture. The nights they counted pennies. The weekends spent painting walls themselves because they couldn't afford contractors. The house wasn't just valuable. It was sacred. Not because of money. Because of memory. Rebecca saw market value. Richard had seen a future. Margaret saw a lifetime. Then Thomas showed her the final document. And this one hurt more than all the others combined. Because it wasn't about money. Or property. Or inheritance. It was about replacement. The document was a preliminary admission inquiry. A nursing facility outside Bloomington. Margaret's name appeared throughout the paperwork. Basic information. Age. Medical history. Emergency contacts. The form wasn't complete. But someone had already started it. Someone had already begun imagining a future where Margaret no longer lived in her own home. Her hands became ice cold. Who filled this out? Thomas hesitated. Then answered carefully. The contact number listed belongs to Rebecca. The room spun. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just enough for Margaret to realize how deeply she'd been betrayed. She had spent months believing they were worried about her. Concerned about her well-being. Trying to help. Now she understood. The conversations. The suggestions. The constant questions. The pressure. It had never been about helping. It had been about positioning. Preparing. Waiting. For several moments Margaret simply sat there. Silent. Thinking. Remembering. Mourning. Because this felt like another death. Not the death of a husband. The death of an illusion. The death of the son she thought she knew. Finally she looked at Thomas. What would Richard tell me to do? Thomas seemed surprised by the question. Then he smiled sadly. I didn't know your husband. He paused. But based on everything you've told me. His expression softened. I think he'd tell you to protect yourself. Margaret nodded slowly. Because she already knew that answer. Richard had spent his entire life protecting their family. Now. It was her turn. That evening she drove home alone. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across the fields. The world looked exactly the same. And yet. Nothing felt the same anymore. When she pulled into the driveway, she remained inside the car for several minutes. Just looking at the house. The porch. The windows. The oak tree Richard planted decades earlier. Everything suddenly felt fragile. Not because someone could take it. Because the people she trusted most had already tried. Inside the house she moved slowly. Turning on lamps. Straightening cushions. Following familiar routines. Eventually she stopped in front of a framed photograph. Richard. Daniel. Herself. Taken 20 years earlier. Everyone smiling. Everyone happy. Margaret touched the glass lightly. Then she whispered something she never imagined saying. I don't know who he is anymore. The words broke her heart. Because they were true. Later that night her phone rang. Daniel. For a moment she considered ignoring it. Instead she answered. Hi, Mom. The same voice. The same familiar voice. Yet somehow different now. Hi, sweetheart. The old habit slipped out automatically. Daniel sounded cheerful. Relaxed. As if nothing in the world was wrong. As if he hadn't been discussing nursing homes. As if Rebecca hadn't been researching her house. As if none of it existed. We were thinking about coming by this weekend. Margaret gripped the phone tighter. We? Me and Rebecca. A pause. Then Daniel added. We just want to make sure you're doing okay. Margaret closed her eyes. Because for the first time, she heard the sentence differently. Not concern. Surveillance. Not love. Assessment. Not family. Strategy. And in that moment, Margaret made a decision. She would not confront them. Not yet. She would not argue. She would not accuse. She would not reveal what she knew. Instead, she would smile. Listen. Watch. And prepare. Because Daniel and Rebecca believed they were planning her future. What they didn't know was that Margaret had just started planning hers. And before long, everything would change. Part 4. The weekend arrived sooner than Margaret expected. Ever since her meeting with Thomas, time seemed to move differently. Slower. Heavier. Each day carried information she wished she had never learned. Yet every morning she woke up with the same realization. The truth had not changed. Daniel and Rebecca were still the same people they had been the day before. The only difference was that now Margaret could finally see them clearly. Saturday afternoon arrived bright and warm. The kind of Indiana day Richard always loved. The sky stretched endlessly above the neighborhood. The oak tree in the front yard swayed gently in the breeze. For years that tree had symbolized family. Roots. Strength. Continuity. Now Margaret found herself staring at it from the kitchen window and wondering how something so strong could survive storms for decades, while families sometimes fractured in silence. At exactly 1 o'clock, Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway. Rebecca stepped out first. Smiling. Carrying a casserole dish. The perfect daughter-in-law. At least on the surface. Daniel followed behind. Wearing the same easy smile he had used his entire life whenever he wanted something. Margaret opened the door. And for a brief moment, her heart betrayed her. Because she still saw her son. Not the man from the documents. Not the man discussing nursing homes. Not the man calculating property transfers. She saw the little boy who once ran into her arms after school. The little boy who used to shout, "Mom! Guess what happened today?" The little boy who once believed she could fix anything. The memory hit her unexpectedly. Sharp. Painful. Then it disappeared. Reality returned. Daniel hugged her. "Hi, Mom." Margaret smiled. Come in. Nothing in her voice revealed the truth. Nothing in her expression betrayed what she knew. Because she had made a choice. She would not confront them. Not yet. The afternoon unfolded almost normally. Almost. Rebecca carried the casserole into the kitchen. Daniel turned on a football game in the living room. Coffee brewed. Conversations drifted between ordinary topics. Weather. Neighbors. Church events. Traffic. To an outsider, they would have looked like any family spending a pleasant Saturday together. But Margaret noticed everything now. Every glance. Every pause. Every carefully chosen question. Because once trust breaks, you start hearing things differently. About 30 minutes into the visit, Rebecca asked the first question. It sounded innocent. Completely harmless. Have you been keeping up with the yard work okay? Margaret nodded. Of course. Rebecca smiled. That's good. Then came the pause. A deliberate pause. The kind designed to create an opening. You know. Rebecca stirred her coffee. There are communities where they handle all that for you. Margaret felt something tighten inside her chest. But outwardly she remained calm. What communities? Oh, retirement communities. Rebecca's voice sounded cheerful. Helpful. Practiced. No lawn care. No maintenance. No worries. Margaret took a sip of coffee. Slowly. Carefully. Then she smiled. I'm quite happy here. A flicker crossed Rebecca's face. Gone almost immediately. But Margaret saw it. Disappointment. Later, Daniel joined the conversation. Almost as if they had rehearsed it. Mom, Rebecca has a point. Margaret looked at him. His expression remained relaxed. Concerned. Reasonable. Exactly the way someone looks when trying to disguise pressure as kindness. You're 71. Margaret smiled slightly. I hadn't noticed. Daniel laughed. But the conversation continued. We just worry about you. There it was. The phrase. The same phrase Thomas had warned her about. The same phrase hidden inside every discussion. Concern. Worry. Protection. Words that sounded loving. Until you learned what sat behind them. Margaret nodded politely. I appreciate that. And she meant it. She appreciated the concern. She simply no longer believed it was real. A few minutes later Rebecca excused herself to use the bathroom. Margaret watched her disappear upstairs. Then something unusual happened. Daniel lowered his voice. Mom. Margaret looked up. What is it? Daniel hesitated. As though preparing a speech. We've been thinking. The sentence immediately put Margaret on guard. Whenever people begin with those words, bad news usually follows. Daniel leaned forward. You've been alone for a while now. A pause. We don't want you isolated. Another pause. We think maybe it's time to start considering other options. There it was again. Not a suggestion. A campaign. A carefully repeated campaign. Margaret remembered the nursing home paperwork. The admission forms. The brochures. Suddenly every conversation felt scripted. Every concern felt manufactured. Every smile felt borrowed. Yet she continued listening. Because knowledge is powerful. And people reveal far more when they believe you know nothing. That evening after they left, Margaret sat alone in the living room. The silence returned. But it felt different now. More honest. The house no longer pretended. The walls no longer lied. Only people did. She stared at Richard's favorite chair. A habit she had developed since his death. Sometimes she imagined he was still sitting there. Reading. Smiling. Listening. That night she found herself speaking aloud. Again. Would you believe this, Richard? Her voice cracked slightly. The empty room offered no answer. But memories arrived instead. One after another. She remembered the first year they bought the house. The furnace had failed during January. Money was tight. Very tight. Richard worked construction. Margaret worked part-time at a pharmacy. There were weeks when every dollar mattered. One night she suggested selling the house. Moving somewhere cheaper. She could still remember Richard's response. Perfectly. No. He had smiled. Then wrapped an arm around her shoulders. This house isn't just wood and drywall. He looked around the unfinished living room. One wall still lacked paint. The carpet was worn. The furniture mismatched. But Richard saw something different. This is where our family grows. At the time, Daniel had been 6 years old. Running through the hallways. Laughing. Leaving fingerprints everywhere. Richard had spent years building that future. Board by board. Paycheck by paycheck. Dream by dream. And now, someone was treating it like a real estate listing. Margaret suddenly stood and walked upstairs. There was something she needed to see. Something she hadn't looked at in years. The attic. The narrow staircase creaked beneath her feet. Dust floated through the afternoon light. Boxes lined the walls. Christmas decorations. Old school projects. Family keepsakes. Memories. She searched quietly until she found the box she wanted. Daniel. School years. The label had faded slightly. Margaret carried it downstairs. Then opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of reminders. Report cards. Little League photographs. Birthday cards. Artwork. Tiny fragments of childhood. The first item she picked up was a handmade Mother's Day card. Construction paper. Crayons. Crooked letters. Inside, 10-year-old Daniel had written. When I grow up, I'll always take care of you. Margaret stopped reading. The tears came before she could stop them. Not because of what the card said. Because of what it meant. Because somewhere between that little boy and the man he became, something had gone terribly wrong. The next morning Margaret attended church. She almost stayed home. But routine mattered. Faith mattered. Especially now. After the service, she sat beside her longtime friend Helen Porter. Helen was 74. Widowed. Sharp-minded. The kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. For nearly 30 years, she and Margaret had shared birthdays, holidays, and countless cups of coffee. As they walked toward the parking lot, Helen suddenly stopped. You look tired. Margaret smiled weakly. I'm fine. Helen raised an eyebrow. The expression immediately reminded Margaret why lies never worked on old friends. No. Helen said quietly. You're not. Margaret hesitated. Then surprised herself. For the first time. She told someone. Not everything. Not the investigation. Not the documents. But enough. Enough for Helen to understand. Enough for Helen to see the pain. When Margaret finished speaking, Helen remained silent for several moments. Then she reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. You know something? Margaret looked at her. What? Helen's eyes softened. Richard would be proud of you. The words hit harder than anything else that week. Harder than the nursing home forms. Harder than the emails. Harder than the betrayal itself. Because suddenly Margaret realized something. She had spent weeks feeling powerless. Like a victim. Like someone being pushed toward an ending she didn't choose. But Richard had never raised a victim. And he certainly hadn't married one. Helen smiled gently. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're in the way. Margaret felt tears threatening again. This time she didn't fight them. Because for the first time since discovering the truth, someone saw her. Not her house. Not her savings. Not her estate. Her. The woman. The wife. The mother. The widow. The human being. And that reminder changed something inside her. A small shift. But an important one. The sadness remained. The betrayal remained. But beneath both, something new began to grow. Resolve. Because Margaret was finally beginning to understand something. Daniel and Rebecca believed they were waiting for her future. What they didn't realize was that she had already started protecting it. And very soon, their carefully constructed plans would begin falling apart. Part 5. The following Monday morning, Margaret called her attorney. His name was Charles Whittaker. He had been handling legal matters for her family for nearly 20 years. Richard trusted him. Which meant Margaret trusted him too. When Charles answered, she immediately heard concern in his voice. Margaret. A pause. It's been a while. Yes. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. I need to see you. Something in her tone must have alarmed him. Because he didn't ask questions. He simply said, come in this afternoon. The law office sat in a red brick building near downtown Bloomington. Margaret had visited many times over the years. Usually for ordinary matters. Updating paperwork. Property records. Estate planning. The kind of tasks responsible adults handle without much thought. Today felt different. Today she wasn't protecting documents. She was protecting herself. Charles greeted her personally. After a few minutes of small talk, he noticed her expression. His smile disappeared. What's happened? Margaret took a deep breath. Then she told him everything. The strange questions. The nursing home forms. The emails. The investigation. The property inquiries. Everything. Charles listened carefully. Without interrupting. Without rushing. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Finally he sighed. I'm sorry. Margaret nodded. So am I. Charles folded his hands. What do you want to do? The question surprised her. Because everyone else seemed focused on what Daniel wanted. What Rebecca wanted. What was convenient. What made sense. Charles was the first person to ask what Margaret wanted. The answer came immediately. I want control of my life. Charles smiled slightly. Good. Then he opened a legal folder. Let's start there. For nearly 3 hours they reviewed everything. Every account. Every property document. Every authorization. Every beneficiary designation. Margaret quickly discovered something disturbing. Over the past year, Daniel had repeatedly tried to position himself closer to her finances. Never directly. Never obviously. Always gradually. A signature here. An authorization there. A suggestion. A recommendation. A favor. Individually. None of it looked suspicious. Together. It looked like a roadmap. A roadmap leading directly toward control. Charles eventually removed his glasses. Then looked at Margaret carefully. Has Daniel ever had direct access to any of your accounts? No. Good. Has he ever been listed as co-owner? No. Good. Another pause. Then Charles said something important. Margaret, the law is still on your side. The words brought unexpected relief. Because for weeks she had felt cornered. Trapped. outnumbered. Now she remembered something. The house belonged to her. The decisions belonged to her. The future belonged to her. That afternoon Charles introduced another person into the conversation. Judge Robert Lawson. Retired. 76 years old. Highly respected throughout Monroe County. He and Richard had known each other for decades. Margaret remembered attending community events with him years ago. Robert listened quietly as Charles summarized the situation. When the explanation ended, the retired judge looked directly at Margaret. His eyes were kind. But sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching human nature reveal itself. Do you know what disappoints me most? Margaret shook her head. Robert sighed. It's not greed. Then what? It's entitlement. The word lingered. Heavy. Meaningful. Robert continued. Greed wants something. He paused. Entitlement believes it already owns it. Margaret felt a chill. Because that was exactly what this felt like. Not hope. Not expectation. Ownership. Daniel and Rebecca weren't behaving like people waiting for an inheritance. They were behaving like people who believed the inheritance already belonged to them. The next several days became a blur of meetings. Paperwork. Appointments. Decisions. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something unexpected. Purpose. Every morning she woke up with tasks to complete. Not because she wanted revenge. But because she wanted certainty. Security. Peace. She replaced several legal authorizations. Updated financial instructions. Reviewed estate documents. Strengthened ownership records. Everything remained completely legal. Completely transparent. Completely hers. Yet with each signature, she felt stronger. The fear slowly began to fade. Meanwhile, Daniel and Rebecca continued calling. And something interesting happened. Once Margaret stopped seeing them as trusted family members, their behavior became easier to recognize. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subjects. The house. Money. Future plans. Living arrangements. One evening Daniel called during dinner. Margaret answered. Hi, Mom. Hello, sweetheart. The old words still came naturally. Even now. Daniel sounded unusually cheerful. We were thinking maybe we could help organize some of your paperwork. Margaret nearly smiled. There it was again. The paperwork. Always the paperwork. No thank you. A brief pause. Then. You sure? Very sure. Another pause. Longer this time. The disappointment was almost audible. A few days later Rebecca stopped by unexpectedly. Again. Margaret had begun noticing how often these visits occurred now. Particularly after discussions involving finances. Rebecca carried cookies. Store-bought. Pretending they were homemade. Margaret noticed immediately. She didn't mention it. Instead she invited her inside. They sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The same kitchen where Daniel had once done homework. The same kitchen where Richard drank coffee every morning for 30 years. The same kitchen Rebecca was quietly trying to claim. Eventually Rebecca leaned forward. Have you thought any more about downsizing? Margaret almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the persistence had become predictable. No. Rebecca smiled. A little too tightly. A house this size can become overwhelming. Margaret looked around. The kitchen appeared exactly as it always had. Comfortable. Clean. Peaceful. Nothing about it felt overwhelming. Except perhaps Rebecca's determination. I managed just fine. Rebecca nodded. But disappointment flashed across her face once again. Margaret saw it. And stored it away. Another clue. Another confirmation. Another piece of evidence. That night Margaret sat on the porch swing. Richard's swing. The one he built 28 years earlier. Summer air drifted across the neighborhood. Children played down the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Comforting sounds. Margaret closed her eyes. And allowed herself to remember. Not the betrayal. Not the investigation. Not the nursing home forms. The good years. The real years. The years before greed entered the picture. She remembered Daniel at age 8. Running across the lawn. Holding a kite. Laughing so hard he could barely breathe. She remembered Christmas mornings. Birthday cakes. Family vacations. School plays. Graduation. Thousands of memories. Thousands. And that was what hurt most. Because people often assume betrayal begins when someone does something cruel. They're wrong. Betrayal begins much earlier. It begins when love becomes conditional. When gratitude becomes expectation. When family becomes opportunity. The following Friday afternoon. Another unexpected visitor arrived. A young woman named Emily Harper. 22 years old. College student. Neighbor. Margaret had known her since she was a child. Emily often helped elderly residents in the neighborhood. Carrying groceries. Mowing lawns. Checking on widows during storms. Small acts of kindness. The kind that restored your faith in people. That afternoon she brought fresh muffins. And stayed for tea. During their conversation, Emily mentioned something surprising. Your husband helped my family once. Margaret smiled. Richard helped a lot of people. Emily nodded. My dad lost his job when I was little. Her eyes softened. I never forgot what your husband did. Margaret felt emotion rising unexpectedly. Richard rarely talked about the people he helped. Most of the time she only learned years later. Emily smiled. People still talk about him. Then she added something Margaret would remember forever. Good people leave things behind. A pause. Not just money. The words lingered. Long after Emily left. Good people leave things behind. Not just money. Legacy. Character. Values. Opportunity. Hope. Suddenly Margaret found herself thinking differently. Not about protecting her assets. About protecting her legacy. Because perhaps those weren't the same thing. And that thought would soon change everything. By the time she went to bed that night, an entirely new plan had begun forming in her mind. A plan Daniel and Rebecca could never have imagined. A plan that had nothing to do with punishment. And everything to do with purpose. The house had always represented more than money. Now Margaret intended to prove it. And before long, the future Daniel thought he was inheriting would look very different indeed. Part 6. The idea did not arrive all at once. It came quietly. Piece by piece. Like morning light entering a room through closed curtains. Margaret woke before sunrise the next day. And for the first time in weeks. She did not wake up afraid. She lay still in bed. Listening to the soft hum of the house. The old pipes. The ticking clock. The faint rustle of leaves outside the window. This house had been her shelter. Her memory. Her proof that love had once lived here. But now she understood something Richard would have understood immediately. A house could hold memories. But a legacy had to keep moving. It had to reach people. It had to help someone breathe easier. Stand taller. Begin again. Margaret sat up slowly. Then she whispered into the dim morning light. All right, Richard. A pause. I know what to do. At 9 o'clock, she called Charles Whitaker. Her attorney answered on the second ring. Margaret? I want to make changes. Charles went quiet for a moment. Then he said. What kind of changes? Margaret looked out the bedroom window. The oak tree Richard had planted stood tall in the front yard. Its branches moved gently in the wind. The kind that makes sure this family remembers what matters. By 11:30, Margaret was sitting in Charles's office again. This time, she did not bring fear with her. She brought purpose. Charles sat across from her with a legal pad. Judge Robert Lawson joined them by speakerphone. His voice sounded steady and warm. Margaret placed both hands on her purse and took a slow breath. I don't want Daniel and Rebecca to control anything. Charles nodded. That can be arranged. But I also don't want everything simply locked away. Another pause. I want Richard's name attached to something good. Charles leaned back slightly. Now he understood. Margaret continued. There are students in this town who can't afford college. There are widows who don't know where to turn after their husbands pass. There are families who need help before one bad month destroys them. Her voice grew softer. Richard spent his life helping quietly. She looked down at her hands. I think it's time the quiet part became permanent. That was how the Whitmore Community Trust began. Not with a grand announcement. Not with cameras. Not with applause. Just 3 older adults in a small law office. A folder of documents. And one widow who had finally decided that greed would not be the final chapter of her marriage. The trust would fund local scholarships. Small emergency grants. Community programs for older widows. And a yearly award in Richard Whitmore's name. For young people who had shown character when nobody was watching. Charles drafted the preliminary documents. Judge Lawson reviewed the structure. Margaret listened carefully. She asked questions. She took notes. She refused to be rushed. For years, Daniel had treated her as though she was becoming too old to understand. But that afternoon, Margaret understood everything. Very clearly. Then came the difficult part. Her will. Charles removed a document from the folder. Margaret, we need to discuss Daniel. The name landed heavily in the room. Margaret looked toward the window. Outside, people walked along the sidewalk. Life continuing. As if nothing inside this office could break a mother's heart. I know. Charles spoke gently. You are not required to leave him anything. Margaret nodded. I know. But mothers are complicated. Even betrayed mothers. There was still a part of her that remembered the little boy with the missing front tooth. The handmade cards. The baseball games. The feverish nights. The whispered prayers. Love does not disappear simply because someone becomes unworthy of it. That is what makes betrayal so painful. If love ended neatly, it would hurt less. Margaret closed her eyes. Then she said, I want him named. Charles looked up. Named? Yes. Her voice was calm. I do not want anyone to say I forgot him. A long silence followed. Then Judge Lawson spoke through the speakerphone. Margaret, what exactly do you have in mind? She opened her eyes. $1. Charles did not react. But the room changed. Even through the phone, Judge Lawson remained quiet. Margaret continued. Daniel gets $1. A pause. Rebecca gets $1. Her voice did not shake. Not because I forgot them. Another pause. Because I remembered exactly who they became. Charles wrote it down. Slowly. Carefully. As if the words themselves carried weight. And they did. $1 was not money. It was a message. It said. You were considered. You were named. You were not overlooked. You were removed. On purpose. Margaret felt no joy in it. No satisfaction. Only sadness. But sadness with a spine. There is a difference. After the meeting, Charles walked her to the door. Before she stepped outside, he said, "Richard would be proud of you." Margaret stopped. Those words again. Helen had said them. Now Charles. And somehow hearing them twice made them feel true. Margaret smiled faintly. "I hope so." Charles looked at her with kindness. "I know so." Over the next few days, the paperwork moved quickly. Not carelessly. Quickly. There is a difference. Charles filed what needed to be filed. Judge Lawson reviewed what needed review. Thomas Grady delivered copies of the evidence he had collected. Bank instructions were updated. Authorizations were revoked. Property protections were strengthened. The locks were scheduled to be changed. Security cameras were installed near the front porch and driveway. Not because Margaret wanted to live in fear, but because she refused to live blindly. Every small step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Her name. Her house. Her future. Her peace. Daniel called twice that week. Margaret answered once. His voice sounded strained. "Mom, Rebecca said you seemed distant the other day." Margaret stood in the kitchen, looking at the pantry door where Daniel's childhood height marks still remained. "I've had a lot on my mind." "What kind of things?" There it was. The quickness. The hunger beneath the concern. Margaret heard it now. "I'm just organizing." A pause. Organizing what? She smiled gently, though he could not see it. "My life." Daniel went quiet, then forced a small laugh. "Well, if you need help, that's what I'm here for." Margaret looked at the old pencil marks on the door. Age 6. Age 7. Age 8. She remembered Richard holding the ruler. Daniel standing straight, trying to look taller. "I know what you're here for, Daniel." The words almost slipped out. But she did not say them. Not yet. Instead, she replied, "I'll let you know." And ended the call. The lock change happened Thursday morning. A locksmith named Mr. Alvarez arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. Kind eyes. Gray beard. Quiet hands. He replaced the front door lock. The back door lock. The garage entry. And the side basement door. Margaret watched from the hallway. Each turn of the screwdriver sounded small. Ordinary. But to her, it sounded like freedom. Click. One boundary restored. Click. One assumption broken. Click. One door no longer open to people who felt entitled to walk through it. When Mr. Alvarez handed her the new keys, Margaret held them in her palm for a long moment. For small pieces of metal. Nothing more. And yet, they felt heavier than gold. "Do you need extra copies?" he asked. Margaret closed her fingers around the keys. "No." A pause. "Not this time." That evening, she made tea and sat on the porch swing. The neighborhood was quiet. A soft orange sunset rested over the roofs across the street. For the first time in a long time, Margaret did not feel like she was waiting for something to happen to her. She felt like she had chosen. And choice is powerful. Especially after weeks of feeling cornered. She thought about Daniel. She wondered when he would discover the locks had changed. She wondered what Rebecca would say. She wondered whether anger would come first. Or panic. Then she felt ashamed for wondering. Because no mother wants to imagine her son that way. No mother wants to prepare herself against the child she raised. But sometimes love and protection stand on opposite sides of the same door. And this time, Margaret chose protection. The next morning, Thomas called again. His voice was low. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you should know something." Margaret straightened. "What happened?" "There was another call made to the nursing facility yesterday." Her hand tightened around the phone. "By Rebecca?" "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes. Thomas continued. She asked whether the admission date could be moved up. For a moment, Margaret could not speak. The room seemed to narrow around her. The walls, the floor, the air. Moved up. Not cancelled. Not reconsidered. Moved up. Rebecca was not slowing down. She was accelerating. Margaret swallowed carefully. Did she give a reason? Thomas hesitated. Then said. She told them the family was concerned you were becoming difficult. Difficult. That word nearly made Margaret laugh. A dry, hollow laugh. So that was the new story. Not independent. Not grieving. Not cautious. Difficult. A woman becomes difficult when she stops being useful. A widow becomes difficult when she refuses to surrender. A mother becomes difficult when she says no. Margaret's voice was quiet when she finally answered. Thank you, Thomas. Are you all right? She looked around her kitchen. The sunlight. The clean counters. The old clock. The home she had built with her husband. No. A pause. But I will be. That afternoon, Margaret made one final appointment with Charles. She wanted every document checked one more time. Every clause. Every signature. Every instruction. No gaps. No confusion. No loose ends Daniel could pull apart later. Charles reassured her. The trust is valid. The property protections are valid. The revised will is valid. The authorization changes are valid. Margaret nodded. And if they challenge it? Judge Lawson, sitting in the room this time, answered. They can try. He folded his hands on the table. But trying and winning are very different things. Margaret felt a quiet strength settle in her chest. Not triumph. Not revenge. Strength. The kind built from grief. Truth. And a woman finally remembering her own worth. That night she did something simple. She baked Richard's favorite apple cake. Not for Daniel. Not for Rebecca. Not for visitors. For herself. The smell filled the house. Cinnamon. Butter. Warm apples. For a while, the kitchen felt like it used to. Margaret cut one slice and placed it on a small plate. Then, out of habit, she almost set aside a second plate for Richard. Her hand stopped halfway. The old ache returned. Gentle. Familiar. She placed the knife down. Then whispered. I miss you. The house remained quiet. But this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt like witness. Like Richard was still there in the places love had marked. Margaret carried the slice to the table and sat alone. Before taking a bite, she looked toward the hallway. Toward the front door. Toward the new lock. And she knew. Something was coming. Daniel and Rebecca would not accept this quietly. People who believe they own something do not react calmly when they find the door closed. But Margaret was ready now. Not loud. Not cruel. Not afraid. Ready. And at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, the first knock came. Then another. Harder. Then Rebecca's voice cut through the quiet dawn. Margaret. Open this door right now. Margaret stood in the hallway. Wearing her robe. One hand resting lightly on the banister. She did not move. Outside, the pounding grew louder. Then Rebecca shouted again. Why doesn't my key work? Margaret closed her eyes for one brief second. There it was. Not. Are you okay? Not. Did something happen? Not. We were worried. Only. Why doesn't my key work? And in that moment, Margaret understood completely. They had never come to check on her. They had come to enter. To claim. To take. She opened her eyes. Straightened her shoulders. And waited. Because this time, they were the ones standing outside. Part 7. The pounding continued. Hard. Sharp. Relentless. Margaret stood quietly in the hallway. The morning sunlight had only just begun to filter through the front windows. Outside, Rebecca's voice rose again. Margaret. Another bang. Open the door. The sound echoed through the house. The same house where Daniel had learned to walk. The same house where Christmas mornings had once begun with laughter. The same house where Richard had spent 43 years building a family. And now, the front door sounded like the entrance to a battlefield. Margaret felt sadness. But surprisingly, she did not feel fear. Fear had disappeared sometime during the last few weeks. The truth had replaced it. And truth can be painful. But it can also be freeing. Another knock. Harder this time. Then Rebecca shouted. My key doesn't work. There it was again. Not concern. Not confusion. Possession. The assumption that a key should work. The assumption that access belonged to her. Margaret slowly walked toward the front window. Careful not to be seen. She looked through a small gap in the curtains. Rebecca stood on the porch. Arms crossed. Angry. Impatient. Daniel stood nearby. Looking frustrated. His hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Margaret noticed something immediately. Neither of them looked worried. Not even slightly. If they genuinely believed something might be wrong, their faces would be different. Their posture would be different. Everything would be different. Instead, they looked inconvenienced. Like people locked out of a building they expected to enter. The doorbell rang. Again. And again. And again. Margaret checked the clock. 6:07 a.m. Too early for visitors. Too early for emergencies. Too early for anything except entitlement. Finally Daniel spoke. His voice carried clearly through the door. Mom. Margaret remained silent. Mom, I know you're in there. Another pause. Then. Open the door. Not. Are you okay? Not. Please call us. Not. We're worried. Simply. Open the door. An order. Not a request. Margaret felt her heart break a little more. Because once upon a time, Daniel had never spoken to her that way. Outside, Rebecca's patience was disappearing. We shouldn't have to stand out here. Margaret closed her eyes. That sentence told her everything. Not. We want to see if she's safe. Not. Something could be wrong. Instead. We shouldn't have to stand out here. The problem wasn't Margaret. The problem was the barrier. The locked door. The boundary. The word no. Some people can tolerate almost anything. Except boundaries. Then something happened. Something that permanently changed the way Margaret saw her son. Daniel walked down the porch steps. Across the driveway. Toward his truck. Margaret frowned. What was he doing? 30 seconds later. He returned carrying something heavy. At first she couldn't tell what it was. Then her stomach dropped. A sledgehammer. Not enormous. Not dramatic. but unmistakable. A real sledgehammer. Margaret felt all the air leave her lungs. For several seconds she simply stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. Daniel climbed the porch steps, holding the hammer casually, as though this were perfectly normal. As though carrying a demolition tool to your mother's house at sunrise made complete sense. Rebecca looked at it, and did not seem surprised. That hurt almost as much, because it suggested they had already discussed this possibility. Daniel stood in front of the door. His voice carried through the wood. If she won't open it. A pause. We'll force our way in. Everything stopped. The world. The morning. Time itself. Margaret heard nothing after that. Only those words. We'll force our way in. Not because he was worried. Not because he thought she had fallen. Not because he feared for her safety. Because he wanted access. Access to something he believed belonged to him. And in that moment, Margaret finally understood. The little boy from the Mother's Day cards. The teenager who hugged her after football games. The young man who once cried at Richard's funeral. That person was gone. Standing outside her front door was a stranger wearing her son's face. Margaret stepped away from the window. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. From grief. Real grief. The kind that arrives when hope dies. She walked slowly into the living room. Richard's chair sat exactly where it always had. Morning sunlight touched one armrest. Margaret stared at it. Then sat down. For several moments she said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. The evidence was complete. No investigation could reveal more. No document could hurt worse. No text message could cut deeper. She had heard it herself. From his own mouth. We'll force our way in. The tears finally came. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just silent tears rolling down tired cheeks. Margaret thought about the handmade Mother's Day card. The little note. You are my hero. She thought about the birthday cakes. The scraped knees. The school concerts. The years she and Richard sacrificed everything to give Daniel opportunities they never had. Then she thought about the hammer. And somehow, the contrast hurt more than the betrayal itself. Because nobody expects strangers to love them. You expect that from family. The pounding resumed. Rebecca now sounded furious. Daniel, do something. Margaret almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the sentence sounded revealing. Do something. Not. Talk to her. Not. Let's leave. Not. Maybe she needs space. Do something. Force. Control. Pressure. Those were their solutions. Those had always been their solutions. Margaret was only seeing it clearly now. Then her phone rang. Daniel. Margaret looked at the screen. The photograph attached to his contact still showed a smiling family picture from years ago. Richard stood beside him. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked safe. Margaret almost didn't answer. Then she changed her mind. She pressed the button. Hello. Silence. Daniel clearly hadn't expected her to pick up. Finally he spoke. Mom. His voice sounded tense. What are you doing? Margaret stared across the room. At Richard's chair. At the framed photographs. At the life she had spent decades building. I'm having coffee. Another silence. Then. Why won't you open the door? Margaret noticed something. Daniel sounded angry. Not worried. Not relieved. Angry. The distinction mattered. Because if he genuinely feared something had happened, he would have sounded different. Instead, He sounded challenged. As though her independence had become an inconvenience. You changed the locks. It wasn't a question. Margaret sipped her coffee. Yes. Why? The answer was simple. But she didn't give it. Instead she asked. Why are you here at 6 in the morning? Silence. Longer this time. Then Daniel replied, we wanted to check on you. Margaret closed her eyes. The lie sounded weaker than ever. Because she now knew about the nursing home. The paperwork. The emails. The inquiries. The plans. Most importantly, she knew about the hammer. People checking on their mothers do not bring sledgehammers. Outside, Rebecca grabbed the phone. Margaret could hear her immediately. We've been worried sick. Margaret nearly smiled. No. You haven't. People who are worried ask questions. People who are worried knock once. Maybe twice. Then call police. Then call neighbors. Then ask for help. They do not arrive with tools. They do not discuss forcing entry. They do not demand access. Margaret listened quietly. The more Rebecca talked, the more obvious everything became. Eventually Rebecca said, you aren't thinking clearly. There it was. The sentence. The foundation of every nursing home plan. Every guardianship attempt. Every effort to remove someone's independence. You aren't thinking clearly. Margaret had expected it. Still. Hearing it hurt. Because once someone decides you are incapable, they stop respecting your choices. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Margaret never raised her voice. Never argued. Never explained. She simply said, I'm fine. Then she hung up. Outside, Daniel and Rebecca remained on the porch. Talking quietly. Arguing. Gesturing. Trying to decide what to do next. Margaret watched from behind the curtain. And for the first time, she realized something important. They were panicking. Not because they loved her. Because they were losing control. At exactly 6:42 a.m., another vehicle entered the street. A dark sedan. Then another. And another. Margaret recognized them immediately. Charles Whitaker. Judge Robert Lawson. And Officer Grant Collins from the local police department. Right on schedule. Charles had insisted witnesses be present if Daniel reacted badly to the lock changes. Margaret had agreed. At the time it felt unnecessary. Now. It felt wise. Very wise. The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. The morning confrontation was about to become very public. And Daniel and Rebecca had absolutely no idea what was coming next. For weeks they had been planning Margaret's future. Now. The future was arriving. Just not the one they expected. Part 8. Margaret stood behind the living room curtain. Watching. Waiting. For weeks she had imagined this moment. Not because she wanted it. Because she knew it was inevitable. People who believe something belongs to them rarely walk away quietly when they discover it never did. Outside. Daniel looked confused. Rebecca looked furious. And neither of them noticed that the balance of power had already shifted. Charles Whitaker stepped out of his sedan first. Calm. Professional. Carrying a leather briefcase. Judge Robert Lawson exited his vehicle next. Slowly. Deliberately. The retired judge looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent decades listening to excuses. And recognizing the truth hiding behind them. Officer Grant Collins emerged from the third vehicle. Tall. Quiet. Observant. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just present. And sometimes, presence is enough. Daniel frowned immediately. What is this? Rebecca's eyes narrowed. She looked from Charles to the judge. Then toward Officer Collins. The confidence she'd carried only moments earlier seemed to waver. Not disappear. Just crack. Slightly. Charles approached the porch. Professional as always. Good morning. Nobody answered. Rebecca folded her arms. Why are you here? Charles looked toward the front door. Then toward Daniel. I was invited. The sentence landed heavily. Because it reminded everyone of something important. Margaret still controlled who entered her property. Not Daniel. Not Rebecca. Margaret. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. What exactly is going on? Charles remained calm. I think your mother should answer that. Inside the house. Margaret took a slow breath. Then another. Her hands were steady now. Much steadier than they had been weeks ago. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. Only clarity remained. She walked toward the door. Unlocked it. And stepped outside. The morning air felt cool. Fresh. The neighborhood remained quiet. But not completely. A few curtains across the street had already moved. Neighbors noticed things. Especially unusual things. And a confrontation involving a sledgehammer at sunrise qualified as unusual. Margaret stepped onto the porch. Rebecca immediately spoke. What is happening? No hello. No concern. No relief. Margaret noticed. She noticed everything now. Daniel looked at her. Then at the new lock. Then back at her. Mom. His voice sounded forced. You changed the locks. Margaret nodded. Yes. Why? Such a simple question. Yet the answer contained years of disappointment. Broken trust. Hidden motives. Betrayal. Still. Margaret kept her voice calm. Because it's my house. Silence. A very uncomfortable silence. Rebecca laughed. A short laugh. Sharp. Defensive. Nobody said it wasn't your house. Margaret looked directly at her. For several seconds. Then she asked quietly. Then why did you have a key? Rebecca's face tightened. The question lingered. Unanswered. Because some questions don't require answers. They reveal the truth all by themselves. Daniel stepped forward. Trying to regain control. Mom, we've only been trying to help. Margaret felt sadness wash through her. Because she remembered believing that once. Believing it completely. Now the words sounded rehearsed. Empty. Like lines from a script performed too many times. Help? She repeated softly. Daniel nodded. Of course. Margaret looked toward the sledgehammer resting near the porch steps. Then back at her son. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The hammer answered for him. Officer Collins noticed it too. His eyes moved briefly toward the tool. Then toward Daniel. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. Just observation. But Daniel suddenly looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. As if he were seeing the situation through someone else's eyes for the first time. A son. At his mother's home. Before sunrise. Holding a sledgehammer. The image wasn't flattering. Rebecca tried a different approach. Margaret, we're worried about you. There it was again. The phrase. The one they always used. The one that sounded loving until you examined it closely. Margaret looked at her calmly. Are you? Rebecca nodded immediately. Of course. Margaret took a slow breath. Then she asked. How many times did you call the nursing facility? The color drained from Rebecca's face. Instantly. Not dramatically. But noticeably. The reaction lasted less than a second. Yet everyone saw it. Charles saw it. Judge Lawson saw it. Officer Collins saw it. Most importantly, Daniel saw it. What nursing facility? Daniel looked genuinely confused. Margaret noticed. And that surprised her. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure Daniel knew everything. Interesting. Very interesting. Rebecca recovered quickly. Margaret, I don't know what you're talking about. A lie. A weak one. And everyone knew it. Charles opened his briefcase. Slowly. Deliberately. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. Several documents appeared. Neatly organized. Clearly labeled. Prepared. Rebecca's expression changed. Because suddenly she understood. This wasn't an emotional argument. This was evidence. Charles removed one page. Then another. Then another. The silence grew heavier with each document. Finally he spoke. Mrs. Whitmore asked me to review several concerning matters. Daniel frowned. Rebecca said nothing. Charles continued. There were inquiries regarding her property. Another document. Inquiries regarding her finances. Another document. Inquiries regarding nursing home admission procedures. This time nobody interrupted. Because there was nothing to say. The paperwork existed. Facts are stubborn things. Daniel looked at Rebecca. Confused. Then worried. What is he talking about? Rebecca didn't answer. A dangerous sign. Because innocent people usually answer quickly. Guilty people often need time. Rebecca needed time. Unfortunately for her. She didn't have much left. Margaret watched her son carefully. For weeks she had assumed Daniel knew everything. Now she wasn't so certain. He clearly knew about the house. The inheritance. The future plans. But perhaps he didn't know every detail. Perhaps Rebecca had been operating independently in some areas. The realization didn't excuse him. Not even close. But it complicated things. And real life is often complicated. Judge Lawson finally spoke. His voice was calm. Measured. Experienced. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel looked at him. You should understand something. A pause. Your mother is fully competent. Another pause. Fully informed. One more pause. And fully protected. The words hit like stones. Heavy. Unavoidable. Final. Rebecca suddenly lost her patience. This is ridiculous. Her voice rose. Sharp. Angry. We've done nothing wrong. Charles looked at her. Then handed her a copy of one document. Rebecca glanced down. Her face changed. Again. Because this time she recognized it. The nursing home inquiry. The one with her contact information. The one she thought nobody would ever see. For the first time all morning. Rebecca seemed genuinely nervous. Not offended. Not angry. Nervous. The difference mattered. Margaret noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. Daniel grabbed the paper. Read it. Then looked at Rebecca. His expression hardened. What is this? Rebecca opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No answer came. And that silence spoke louder than words. Margaret stood quietly. Watching. Not celebrating. Not enjoying it. Just observing. Because this wasn't victory. Not yet. This was simply truth entering the room. Truth often arrives quietly. But its impact can be enormous. Daniel looked down at the paperwork again. Then at his wife. Then at his mother. For the first time that morning, he appeared uncertain. Genuinely uncertain. As though pieces of a puzzle were suddenly rearranging themselves. As though a story he'd been told no longer fit the evidence in front of him. Margaret saw it happen. And surprisingly, it made her sad. Not satisfied. Sad. Because no mother dreams of seeing disappointment in her son's eyes. Especially when that disappointment involves his own family. The neighborhood was waking up now. Cars passed occasionally. A dog barked somewhere nearby. Across the street, several neighbors pretended not to watch. And failed miserably. Small towns have their own version of front row seats. Curtains. Rebecca looked around. She understood exactly what was happening. The audience. The witnesses. The loss of control. Panic flashed across her face. Just for a moment. Then disappeared. But Margaret saw it. And suddenly, Rebecca made a mistake. A very important mistake. She pointed toward the house. Toward the front porch. Toward everything Richard and Margaret had spent decades building. Then she shouted. After everything we've done for you, that house was going to be ours anyway. Silence. Instant silence. Even the birds seemed to stop. Because some truths arrive accidentally. And once spoken, they can never be taken back. Daniel stared at her. Charles stared at her. Judge Lawson stared at her. Officer Collins stared at her. Margaret simply closed her eyes. Because finally, someone had said it out loud. No more pretending. No more concern. No more worry. No more helpful suggestions. Just the truth. The house was going to be ours anyway. There it was. The entire plan. The entire motive. The entire betrayal. Compressed into one sentence. And from that moment forward, everything began to unravel. Because Rebecca had just revealed the one thing they could never explain away. What happened next would change the future of the Whitmore family forever. Part 9. Rebecca's words hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Impossible to take back. That house was going to be ours anyway. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Because sometimes a single sentence reveals more than months of explanations. Margaret stood quietly on the porch. Looking at the woman she had welcomed into her family almost 16 years earlier. The woman she had defended. Supported. Included in holidays. Included in traditions. Included in memories. And now, the truth had finally escaped. Not through evidence. Not through investigation. Not through legal paperwork. Through Rebecca's own mouth. Daniel stared at his wife. His face had gone pale. What did you just say? Rebecca realized her mistake immediately. Margaret saw it happen. The brief flash of panic. The calculation. The desperate search for a way to undo what had already been done. But some doors close forever. And some words cannot be unsaid. Rebecca tried anyway. That's not what I meant. The response sounded weak. Even to her. Daniel looked down at the paperwork again. Then back at Rebecca. No. His voice was quieter now. More serious. What did you mean? Rebecca didn't answer. Because there wasn't a good answer. Not one that sounded reasonable. Not one that sounded loving. Not one that sounded innocent. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Judge Lawson finally broke the silence. The retired judge looked directly at Daniel. Your mother spent decades building her life. A pause. Nobody inherits a living person's future. Daniel lowered his eyes. The words landed harder than Margaret expected. Because unlike Rebecca, Daniel still seemed capable of feeling shame. And shame can be painful. But it can also be revealing. Officer Collins remained silent. Watching. Listening. Observing. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. People behave differently when they know someone objective is watching. Excuses become harder. Stories become weaker. Reality becomes more difficult to avoid. Charles removed another document from his briefcase. This one thicker than the others. More official. More final. Margaret recognized it immediately. The revised estate documents. The trust paperwork. Everything she had spent weeks preparing. Everything Daniel and Rebecca never saw coming. Charles looked toward Margaret. She nodded. A small movement. But enough. The time had come. Mrs. Whitmore has made several legal changes. Charles spoke calmly. Professionally. Every word precise. Daniel frowned. What changes? Charles opened the folder. The house remains entirely under her ownership. A pause. No one else has any authority regarding the property. Daniel swallowed. Rebecca stared. Neither interrupted. Because deep down, they already knew. This wasn't going where they hoped. Charles continued. All financial authorizations have been updated. Another pause. Several protective measures have been added. Another pause. And the majority of Mrs. Whitmore's estate has been transferred into a charitable trust. Silence. Absolute silence. The neighborhood itself seemed to stop breathing. Daniel blinked. What? Charles repeated the sentence. Slower this time. The majority of the estate has been allocated to the Whitmore Community Trust. Margaret watched the words hit them. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then panic. Rebecca recovered first. That's ridiculous. Charles didn't react. The paperwork has already been completed. No. Rebecca shook her head. No, that's impossible. Charles simply handed her a copy. Reality is difficult to argue with when it's printed on official paper. Rebecca scanned the pages. Her eyes moved faster. Then faster. Then suddenly stopped. Margaret noticed the exact moment she found the number. The percentage. The amount. The realization. Most of it was gone. Not stolen. Not hidden. Redirected. Given purpose. Given meaning. Given a future. Just not the future Rebecca expected. Daniel looked stunned. Genuinely stunned. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. You gave it away? Margaret looked at her son. For a moment. She saw traces of the little boy again. Not because he had changed. Because disappointment had stripped away some of the arrogance. You say that like it wasn't mine to give. Daniel immediately looked away. Because he knew she was right. A light breeze moved through the trees. The oak branches shifted overhead. Margaret suddenly thought of Richard. How many times had they discussed legacy? Not inheritance. Legacy. The difference matters. Inheritance is what people receive. Legacy is what people leave behind. One is about ownership. The other is about impact. Richard understood that. Margaret understood it now too. Rebecca was no longer hiding her anger. This is insane. Her voice echoed across the yard. You worked your entire life for that money. Margaret nodded. Yes. Then why would you give it to strangers? The question revealed everything. Because Rebecca saw only two options. Keep it. Or inherit it. She could not imagine a third possibility. Helping others. Creating opportunities. Building something larger than herself. Those ideas never entered her calculation. Margaret answered softly. They aren't strangers. Rebecca frowned. What? Margaret looked toward the street. Toward the town she had lived in for most of her adult life. Toward the community Richard had spent decades serving. They're the people your father-in-law spent his life helping. Silence. Then she added. And unlike some people. A pause. They never treated kindness like an investment. The sentence landed hard. Very hard. Daniel flinched. Margaret noticed. Because despite everything, he still understood what she meant. Rebecca looked furious. Daniel looked ashamed. There was a difference. A very important difference. For the first time all morning, Daniel stepped away from Rebecca. Not physically far. Just enough to create space. The gesture was small. But meaningful. Margaret saw it. So did Judge Lawson. So did Charles. Rebecca noticed it too. And she didn't like it. Not at all. Then Daniel asked the question Margaret had been expecting. The question every story like this eventually reaches. What about me? There it was. Not. Are you happy? Not. Are you okay? Not. Can we fix this? What about me? Margaret felt another piece of her heart break. Because even now, after everything, he still didn't fully understand. Charles glanced toward Margaret. Waiting. The answer belonged to her. Nobody else. Margaret took a slow breath. Then nodded. Charles opened another page. A final page. One that had not yet been discussed. One that Daniel and Rebecca were completely unprepared for. The revised will contains individual provisions. Charles spoke carefully. Daniel looked hopeful. For one brief second. Hopeful. Margaret noticed. And somehow that hurt more than anger would have. Because even now, part of him still expected a reward. Still expected ownership. Still expected access. Charles continued. Mrs. Whitmore chose to specifically acknowledge both Daniel Whitmore and Rebecca Whitmore. Rebecca immediately straightened. Daniel looked relieved. For one brief moment. They thought they had won something. Margaret watched it happen. The assumption. The expectation. The entitlement. Everything Judge Lawson had warned about. Then Charles read the next sentence. Each individual shall receive $1. Silence. The kind of silence that changes lives. Rebecca blinked. Daniel stared. Neither seemed capable of processing what they had heard. $1. $1. Rebecca laughed. A short, shocked laugh. You're joking. Charles didn't answer. Because legal documents do not joke. Rebecca looked at Margaret. Then back at Charles. Then at the paperwork. Again. And again. Searching desperately for a misunderstanding. There wasn't one. Daniel looked devastated. Not angry. Not yet. Devastated. Because for the first time, he understood the message. Margaret had not forgotten him. That would have been easier. She had remembered him. Completely. And made a decision. Completely. The distinction mattered. And it hurt. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice remained calm. Steady. Measured. I wanted you named. Daniel looked up. Pain visible in his eyes. Mom. A pause. Then Margaret continued. So nobody could ever say I forgot my son. The words nearly broke her. But she kept going. I remembered exactly who you became. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The truth had finally reached the center of the room. And there was nowhere left to hide from it. Across the street. Another curtain shifted. More neighbors watching. More witnesses. More people seeing what greed eventually becomes. Not wealth. Not success. Loss. Rebecca looked furious. Humiliated. Cornered. But Daniel looked different now. Quiet. Thoughtful. Broken. For the first time in weeks. Margaret wondered whether he was finally seeing the damage. Not the financial damage. The personal damage. The human damage. The damage done when a mother realizes her child values her assets more than her presence. Nobody noticed it at first. Not even Margaret. But Daniel's eyes slowly drifted toward the front porch swing. Richard's swing. The swing he built himself. The swing where father and son once sat together during summer evenings. The swing where Richard taught him how to throw a baseball. How to shake hands properly. How to keep promises. Daniel stared at it. And something in his expression changed. Just slightly. Almost imperceptibly. But it changed. Because suddenly, for the first time all morning, he wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the memories. And what happened next would determine whether Daniel Whitmore still had any chance of saving what remained of his relationship with his mother. Part 10. Daniel continued staring at the porch swing. Richard's swing. The old wooden swing that had survived nearly 3 decades of Indiana winters. The paint had been refreshed more than once. The chains had been replaced twice. But the frame remained original. Solid. Reliable. Built by hand. Built by Richard. For years it had simply been furniture. Now. It seemed to hold an entire lifetime. Nobody spoke. Not Charles. Not Judge Lawson. Not Officer Collins. Not Rebecca. Not even Margaret. Because something was happening. Something that couldn't be rushed. Daniel wasn't looking at documents anymore. He wasn't looking at the house. He wasn't looking at the inheritance. For the first time that morning, he appeared to be looking backward. Into memory. Into history. Into himself. And sometimes that journey is far more painful than any punishment. The morning breeze moved through the yard. The oak tree rustled softly overhead. Margaret remembered a summer evening from more than 20 years earlier. Daniel was 12. Richard sat with him on that same swing. Teaching him how to throw a curveball. Teaching him patience. Teaching him responsibility. At one point Daniel became frustrated and threw the baseball into the grass. Richard laughed. Then said something Margaret never forgot. Character isn't what people see when things go right. A pause. It's what remains when things go wrong. At the time it was just another lesson. One of hundreds. Now. Margaret wondered if Daniel remembered it too. Rebecca broke the silence first. Predictably. This is unbelievable. Her voice shook with frustration. You can't seriously think this is fair. Margaret looked at her calmly. Fair. Such an interesting word. Because fairness had never seemed important when nursing home paperwork was being completed behind her back. Fairness had never seemed important when her property was being discussed as though she were already gone. Fairness had never seemed important when plans were being made without her knowledge. And yet now. Suddenly fairness mattered. Judge Lawson folded his arms. Mrs. Whitmore is under no obligation to distribute her estate according to anyone else's expectations. Rebecca immediately turned toward him. But we're family. The sentence lingered. Margaret felt something painful twist inside her chest. Because technically, Rebecca was right. They were family. That was precisely why the betrayal hurt so much. Strangers cannot break your heart in the same way. Only family can do that. Daniel finally spoke. His voice sounded different now. Quieter. Less certain. Mom. Margaret looked at him. And for a brief moment, she saw exhaustion in his eyes. Not anger. Not entitlement. Exhaustion. The kind that appears when someone begins realizing the story they've told themselves may not be true. Did you really think I wanted you gone? The question surprised everyone. Especially Margaret. Because it was not the question she expected. Not after everything. Not after the documents. Not after the hammer. Not after the trust. Yet there it was. Raw. Human. Painful. Margaret considered the question carefully. Then she answered honestly. I think you stopped seeing me. Silence. Daniel lowered his eyes. Margaret continued. Not harshly. Not emotionally. Just truthfully. I think somewhere along the way. A pause. You started seeing my future as yours. The words landed heavily. Because they were true. And truth often hurts most when it arrives without shouting. Daniel looked toward the ground. The gravel driveway. The porch steps. Anywhere except his mother's eyes. Margaret watched him struggle. And despite everything, she felt sadness instead of satisfaction. Because mothers rarely stop loving their children. Even when those children disappoint them. Love doesn't disappear. Trust does. Respect does. But love remains. That is what makes stories like this so painful. Rebecca, however, seemed incapable of reflection. Her frustration continued growing. You've turned everyone against us. Charles raised an eyebrow. No. His voice remained calm. The evidence did that. Rebecca immediately fell silent. Because there was no argument against it. Only resentment. Officer Collins finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. His voice was steady. Professional. Nobody is accusing anyone of a crime. A pause. But what I'm seeing here is a family that stopped communicating honestly a long time ago. The statement felt surprisingly accurate. Because greed had not appeared overnight. Neither had entitlement. Neither had disappointment. Those things grow slowly. Quietly. Like cracks in a foundation. Invisible until the structure begins to fail. Margaret suddenly remembered something. A memory she had not thought about in years. Daniel was 15. He wanted a car. Not because he needed one. Because his friends had them. Richard refused. Daniel became angry. Furious. For nearly a week. Eventually Richard sat him down. Just the two of them. Afterward Daniel apologized. Later that evening Margaret asked what Richard had said. Richard smiled. Then replied. I reminded him that wanting something doesn't make it yours. At the time it solved a teenage argument. Now. The lesson seemed larger. Much larger. Charles closed the folder. The legal portion was finished. The facts had been presented. The documents existed. Nothing else needed proving. The remaining issue wasn't legal. It was personal. Far more difficult. Far more painful. Daniel slowly stepped toward the porch. Not close enough to feel threatening. Just closer. His eyes settled on Margaret. Why didn't you tell me? Margaret almost smiled. Not because the question was funny. Because it revealed how differently they viewed the situation. You mean before I found out? Daniel looked away. For a moment he had no answer. Because there wasn't one. A long silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Very unexpected. Daniel looked toward Rebecca. Not lovingly. Not supportively. Questioningly. As if seeing her differently. as if remembering conversations that suddenly sounded suspicious. Margaret noticed. So did Rebecca. And Rebecca looked nervous. Very nervous. Daniel. She spoke softly. A warning hidden inside his name. But the effect was the opposite. Because now Daniel seemed to be remembering things. Small things. Questions. Comments. Suggestions. Conversations about the house. The future. Retirement communities. Perhaps for the first time. He was examining them honestly. Not through the lens of convenience. But through the lens of consequence. Margaret watched the realization unfold. Slowly. Painfully. And strangely. It gave her no pleasure. Because if Daniel truly understood what had happened, then he would also understand what he had lost. Not money. Not property. Trust. A far more valuable thing. The sun climbed higher. Morning shadows shortened across the lawn. A neighbor walked a dog down the street. Life continued. As it always does. Even when families break apart. Even when hearts change. Even when truths emerge. The world keeps moving. Finally Daniel spoke again. This time barely above a whisper. I should have talked to you. Margaret felt tears threatening. Not because the sentence fixed anything. It didn't. Not even close. But it was the first honest thing he had said all morning. Maybe the first honest thing in a very long time. Rebecca immediately interrupted. We were trying to help. The old phrase again. The familiar phrase. The phrase that had become a shield. Margaret looked at her. Then calmly asked. Help who? Silence. Absolute silence. Because that question reached the center of everything. Help who? Margaret? Or themselves? The answer was obvious. Everyone standing there knew it. Rebecca looked away first. A small moment. But a meaningful one. People rarely avoid eye contact when they're proud of their choices. Judge Lawson checked his watch. Then looked toward Margaret. His expression softened. The legal battle, if it could even be called that, was over. The documents were secure. The property was protected. The trust existed. The future had already been decided. What remained now was emotional. And emotional wounds heal far slower than legal disputes. Margaret looked around her property. The porch. The flower beds. The oak tree. The swing. The front windows. Every corner contained memories. Not investments. Memories. And suddenly she realized something important. The house had never actually been the point. Not really. The house was merely the stage. The real story was about value. About what people choose to treasure. About what they choose to become. Then she looked directly at Daniel. For a long moment. Mother and son. Separated by only a few feet. And yet farther apart than either had ever imagined. Finally she said. Your father spent 30 years building this home. Daniel swallowed. Margaret continued. And all you ever saw was the price. The sentence landed with devastating force. Because deep down, Daniel knew there was truth inside it. Not complete truth. But enough. More than enough. And standing there in the morning sunlight. Surrounded by witnesses. Surrounded by evidence. Surrounded by consequences. Daniel Whitmore finally began facing the one thing he had avoided for months. Himself. And what he would do next would determine whether this story ended with permanent loss. Or the first fragile step toward accountability. Part 11. For several long moments. Nobody said anything. The morning confrontation that had begun with pounding on a locked door had become something else entirely. Something quieter. Something heavier. A reckoning. Not legal. Not financial. Personal. The kind that cannot be solved with paperwork. The kind that follows people home. Daniel stood motionless near the porch steps. His shoulders looked different now. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. As if the certainty he'd carried for months had finally cracked. Margaret watched him carefully. She knew her son. Maybe not as well as she once believed. But she still knew him. And what she saw now wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't entitlement. It was confusion. The painful confusion that arrives when a person realizes they may have become someone they never intended to be. The sledgehammer still rested near the truck. Abandoned. Forgotten. And somehow, that bothered Daniel now. Margaret could see it. His eyes drifted toward it repeatedly. Almost as though he couldn't believe he had brought it. Couldn't believe he had stood outside his mother's house and threatened to force his way inside. Couldn't believe that person had been him. Yet it had. Charles quietly closed his briefcase. The documents had done their job. Facts had been presented. Truth had been exposed. Nothing else needed proving. The rest would depend entirely on character. And character cannot be drafted by attorneys. Rebecca finally broke the silence. Again. This is all because somebody poisoned your mind. Margaret almost smiled. Not because the accusation surprised her. Because it was predictable. When manipulation fails, responsibility becomes inconvenient. Suddenly there must be another explanation. Another influence. Another villain. Anyone except the people who made the choices. Judge Lawson shook his head slowly. No. His voice remained calm. Mrs. Whitmore simply paid attention. The statement landed with quiet force. Because that was exactly what had happened. No conspiracy. No manipulation. No misunderstanding. Margaret had simply started listening. Watching. Questioning. The truth had done the rest. Daniel looked at his mother. Then looked away. Then back again. Finally he spoke. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. A small crack. But real. When did you stop trusting me? The question hurt. Because it revealed how differently they remembered the story. Margaret didn't stop trusting him first. Trust had been damaged long before that. She had simply been the last person to realize it. Margaret answered honestly. The day I realized you were planning my future without asking me. Daniel lowered his head. She continued. The day I discovered people were discussing nursing homes before discussing my wishes. Another pause. The day I became a problem to solve instead of a mother. Silence. Deep silence. Because there was no defense against the truth. Not this truth. A bird landed briefly on one of the oak tree branches. Then flew away. Margaret watched it disappear. And suddenly she felt tired. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes after carrying disappointment for too long. She had spent weeks preparing for confrontation. Preparing for resistance. Preparing for legal protection. Now that it was over. She felt the weight of it all. The grief. The betrayal. The acceptance. Daniel noticed. For the first time all morning. He truly noticed. Not the house. Not the paperwork. Not the trust. Her. His mother. Standing on the porch. Looking older than she had a year ago. Looking lonelier than she had before Richard died. Looking tired. And perhaps for the first time in months. He saw the cost. Not to himself. To her. I never wanted to hurt you. The words came quietly. Almost involuntarily. Margaret believed he meant them. Strangely enough, she believed him. Not because he was innocent. Because most people do not set out intending to hurt someone they love. They simply make small selfish choices. Then justify them. Then repeat them. Eventually those choices become habits. And habits become character. By the time the damage appears, it already feels normal. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. Daniel looked surprised. You do? Yes. A pause. I don't think you wanted to hurt me. She looked directly into his eyes. I think you stopped thinking about how your actions would. That was different. And Daniel knew it. Rebecca crossed her arms. Still defensive. Still angry. Still searching for someone else to blame. You make it sound like we were criminals. Officer Collins shook his head. No one said that. Another pause. But good people can still make selfish decisions. The sentence seemed to settle over the entire yard. Because it was true. Painfully true. Not every betrayal comes from evil. Many come from entitlement. Convenience. Rationalization. The slow erosion of empathy. Margaret suddenly remembered Richard's final weeks. The hospital room. The quiet conversations. The moments when both of them knew time was becoming precious. One evening Richard had taken her hand. Weak. Tired. Yet completely clear. He had said, "Promise me something." Margaret remembered smiling through tears. Anything. Richard squeezed her hand gently. Don't let loneliness convince you to accept less than respect. At the time she thought he was talking about life after widowhood. About friendships. Relationships. Perhaps even remarriage. Now she realized he meant something larger. Much larger. Respect is not optional. Not from strangers. Not from family. Not from anyone. The memory strengthened her. She stood a little straighter. A little taller. Not because she felt powerful. Because she felt certain. There is a difference. Daniel looked toward the porch swing again. Then toward the oak tree. Then toward the front windows. Everywhere memories lived. Everywhere evidence of Richard remained. Finally he spoke. And this time, the words sounded different. Not defensive. Not strategic. Honest. I forgot what Dad built. Margaret felt tears forming. Daniel continued. I kept seeing the house. A pause. I stopped seeing everything inside it. The sentence hit her hard. Because it was true. So painfully true. And hearing him admit it felt like the first genuine step toward accountability. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just accountability. The necessary beginning. Rebecca looked frustrated. Almost alarmed. As though she sensed the conversation moving somewhere she couldn't control. Daniel. His name sounded like a warning. Again. But Daniel didn't respond. For the first time all morning. He wasn't looking at Rebecca. He was looking at his mother. And perhaps for the first time in a very long while. He was listening. Margaret took a deep breath. The cool morning air filled her lungs. Then she said something she had rehearsed many times. Something she thought would feel satisfying. It didn't. It simply felt true. Money can be replaced. Daniel looked up. Margaret continued. Houses can be sold. A pause. Trust is much harder. The words settled between them. Simple. Uncomplicated. Final. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone understood. The house had never been the greatest loss. Trust was. Always trust. The neighborhood had fully awakened by now. Cars moved through the streets. Children waited for school buses. Life continued. Ordinary. Unaware that an entire family had just changed forever. Eventually Judge Lawson stepped forward. His expression gentle. "Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret looked at him. "I think you've made your position very clear." She nodded. "Yes." The retired judge smiled softly. Then said something that stayed with her long afterward. "Protecting yourself is not cruelty." A pause. "It's wisdom." Margaret felt emotion rise unexpectedly. Because widows often struggle with that lesson. Mothers do too. Especially mothers. We spend so much of life giving. That protecting ourselves can feel selfish. Even when it isn't. Charles checked his watch. Officer Collins nodded politely. The morning confrontation was ending. The documents were secure. The property was secure. The trust was secure. Everything that needed protecting had been protected. The only question remaining was what would happen to the relationships. And unfortunately, no attorney could answer that. Daniel took a slow step forward. Then another. Not enough to approach the porch. Just enough to be heard clearly. His eyes looked tired. Red. Regretful. "Mom." A pause. A long pause. Then finally. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. Simple. Small. Powerful. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Because she had imagined hearing those words. Many times. But she also knew something important. An apology is not restoration. It is only a beginning. And beginnings must be followed by choices. Many choices. Over time. Still. For the first time since Richard died. She believed her son might finally understand the damage. And that possibility, however fragile, felt important. Very important. Because the story wasn't over yet. Not for Margaret. Not for Daniel. And certainly not for the legacy Richard Whitmore had spent a lifetime building. Part 12. The apology hung in the morning air. Simple. Quiet. Late. But real. "I'm sorry." Daniel's voice barely rose above a whisper. For a long moment. Margaret said nothing. Not because she didn't hear him. Because she did. Not because she didn't believe him. Because part of her did. But after a certain age. You learn something important. An apology is a seed. Not a harvest. What matters is what grows afterward. The morning confrontation ended shortly after that. Charles gathered his documents. Judge Lawson shook Margaret's hand. Officer Collins nodded politely before returning to his vehicle. One by one, the witnesses left. The driveway slowly emptied. The neighborhood returned to normal. The curtains across the street stopped moving. Cars passed. Dogs barked. Life continued. As it always does. Daniel stood beside his truck. Rebecca had already climbed inside. Silent. Angry. Humiliated. She never apologized. Not that day. Not in the weeks that followed. Some people learn from consequences. Others only resent them. Margaret eventually accepted that she could not control which type of person Rebecca chose to be. Daniel lingered for a few seconds longer. Then looked toward his mother. The distance between them felt enormous. Not because of the yard. Because of everything that had happened. Finally he nodded. A small gesture. Then quietly said, "I'll call you." Margaret simply replied, "Take care of yourself." Daniel climbed into the truck. The engine started. And moments later, they were gone. The silence that followed felt strange. Not empty. Different. Like the silence after a storm finally passes. Margaret stood alone on the porch. Looking at the driveway. Looking at the oak tree. Looking at Richard's swing. For weeks she had been preparing for confrontation. Preparing for conflict. Preparing for loss. Now it was over. And for the first time in months, she could breathe. That afternoon she sat on the porch swing. The same swing where Richard once drank coffee every Saturday morning. The same swing where Daniel learned to throw a baseball. The same swing that had witnessed birthdays, graduations, arguments, celebrations, and ordinary evenings that nobody realizes are precious until they're gone. Margaret gently rocked back and forth. A soft breeze moved through the neighborhood. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt peace. Not happiness. Peace. There is a difference. Happiness comes and goes. Peace stays. Several weeks passed. Then months. Summer slowly gave way to autumn. The leaves turned gold. Then orange. Then crimson. The oak tree Richard planted decades ago looked more beautiful than ever. Margaret spent more time with friends. More time at church. More time volunteering. She stopped waiting for the phone to ring. Stopped worrying about what other people expected. Stopped carrying responsibility for choices she didn't make. And little by little, life became lighter. The Whitmore Community Trust officially launched that fall. No television cameras. No grand ceremony. Just a small gathering at the local community center. A few teachers. A few church members. Several families. And a handful of students. Margaret sat quietly in the back row. Listening. Watching. Remembering. One young woman received the first scholarship. She was the daughter of a single mother. The first person in her family accepted into college. When she stepped to the microphone, her hands trembled. Her voice shook. And then she said something Margaret would never forget. "This opportunity changes everything for me." Margaret felt tears fill her eyes. Because suddenly, Richard's legacy was no longer sitting inside a bank account. It was changing someone's future. Exactly as he would have wanted. After the ceremony ended, the young woman approached Margaret. She didn't know the full story. She didn't know about the betrayal. The investigation. The nursing home forms. The confrontation. She only knew one thing. Someone had believed in her. She hugged Margaret. Then whispered, "Thank you." 3 simple words. Yet somehow they healed something. Not completely. But enough. A few weeks later, Daniel called. Then called again. Then again. The conversations were awkward at first. Careful. Uncertain. Like 2 people learning how to speak honestly after a very long silence. Margaret never rushed the process. Trust returns the same way it leaves. Slowly. One choice at a time. One conversation at a time. One act at a time. Several months after the confrontation, Daniel asked if he could stop by. Alone. Margaret agreed. When he arrived, he wasn't carrying paperwork. He wasn't asking questions about finances. He wasn't discussing the future. Instead, he brought an old cardboard box. The same box Margaret had once kept in the attic. Inside were childhood photographs. Baseball trophies. School projects. Old family memories. Daniel placed the box on the kitchen table. Then sat quietly. For several minutes neither spoke. They simply looked through the photographs together. Like they used to. Before everything became complicated. Before greed. Before entitlement. Before disappointment. Eventually Daniel picked up a photograph. One of Richard standing beside the porch swing. Smiling. Young. Strong. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then softly said, "Dad would have been disappointed in me." Margaret looked at her son. And for the first time, she saw genuine accountability. Not excuses. Not explanations. Accountability. The beginning of wisdom. The beginning of growth. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But healing doesn't require perfection. Only honesty. "I miss him too," she said. Daniel nodded. Neither spoke for several moments. They didn't need to. Some grief is shared. Some lessons are learned silently. That night, after Daniel left, Margaret walked out to the porch. The sun was setting. Golden light stretched across the yard. The oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze. Richard's swing moved softly beneath her. Just as it had for years. Margaret looked toward the horizon. Then smiled. A real smile. The kind that comes after surviving something difficult. The kind that comes after choosing yourself. The kind that comes after discovering that dignity is worth protecting. People often think this story is about a house. It isn't. The house was never the point. The money wasn't the point. The inheritance wasn't the point. The real story was about value. About remembering that love does not require surrender. That kindness does not require weakness. That family does not excuse disrespect. And that protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes. It is necessary. Margaret never regretted her decision. Not the locks. Not the trust. Not the $1. Because none of those choices were about revenge. They were about truth. And truth has a way of setting people free. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. As darkness slowly settled across the neighborhood, Margaret looked up at the stars. Then softly whispered the words she wished Richard could hear. "We did all right." The breeze moved through the trees. The porch swing creaked gently. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the answer. Not in words. But in peace. The kind of peace that comes when a person stops planning for your death. And you start planning your legacy. The house was never Margaret Whitmore's greatest gift. The lesson was. The end. My dear friends, family is a blessing, but boundaries are necessary to protect our peace. If Margaret's story touched your heart today, please leave a comment to let me know you're here. Hug your loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our Family Story Corner. Until next time, stay safe and sweet dreams.